Negotiations in Switzerland to end the war in Iran wrapped up last night with Iran and the United States agreeing to create a deconfliction cell to address the fighting in Lebanon. Attacks in that country are a major sticking point in these talks. Iran's military on Saturday said it was closing the Strait of Hormuz over Israeli strikes in Lebanon. But Vice President J.D. Vance and U.S. Central Command both said this weekend that the strait is open. The vice president is, of course, leading those talks in Switzerland, meeting yesterday with Iran's parliamentary speaker, as well as mediators from Pakistan and Qatar. But the negotiations were almost derailed by President Trump, who threatened new attacks and also the lives of Tehran's top negotiators in response to Iran's threat to close the strait. The president spoke to Fox News yesterday, claiming he told Iranian officials, quote, "You close it and you won't have a country. You won't even make it back to your effing country." A source inside the room when the talks were taking place told MS Now the Iranians were, quote, frustrated by Trump's comments, causing the first round of talks to end earlier than expected. But the Iranians would come back later for more discussions, leading to the so-called deconfliction cell agreement. A statement from mediators from Pakistan and Qatar said the cell would include the Lebanese government and would ensure the adherence of the termination of military operations in Lebanon. Still, it all remains unclear whether that's going to be enough to stop fighting between Iranian-backed Hezbollah and Israel. Then the White House is also pushing back on this. Social media claims that Vice President J.D. Vance was snubbed by Qatari officials during those weekend talks in Switzerland. There's a viral video going around that showed Vance standing alone as leaders around him exchanged hugs and greetings, prompting criticism online and drawing more than 2 million views on social media. But a U.S. official told a correspondent with the Daily Wire that the interpretation online was complete nonsense, in their words, saying the American and Qatari delegations had already spent hours together and there was no need for a formal re-greeting. However, Iranian state media claimed the foreign minister snubbed Vance during a pre-talks photo op and refused to take part in a joint media appearance. U.S. officials maintain Iran had previously agreed to the event but left after seeing the large media presence. A lot for us to get into here. MS Now White House reporter Akayla Gardner is on set with me. So many moving parts here. Those images coming out of Switzerland where online it was supposed to be that it was embarrassing for Vance to be snubbed that way. That's just one part of a pretty messy weekend of these initial talks. Where does the White House say that things stand right now?
The major development over the weekend was that deconfliction cell that they're talking about. They're talking about setting up channels of communication to avoid the military skirmishes that we've continued to see in southern Lebanon. The X factor really is Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who continues to say that he will affirm Israel's right to defend itself. But Iran has very much successfully tied these two issues together. We saw them using their leverage in the Strait of Hormuz, threatening to reclose it. The U.S. continues to say it's open and that oil is flowing there. But the imagery that you talked about there was so stark because, as we've talked about over weeks now, there was a time when Vice President J.D. Vance was always deferring to Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, who were leading these talks. And then visually, you could just see how that has changed. That calculus has changed so much. J.D. Vance is very much the face of these talks. He has done a huge media blitz. Frankly, that was initially tied to his book. But he has become the face of this. And we are seeing conservative outrage, frankly, about the memorandum of understanding and the text there. He says there's, quote, gentleman agreements, things that are understood that are not publicly known yet. That is really what I'm watching. Can we actually see the text that he says some of these agreements are actually written down, but still not publicly known to us?
Those agreements would have to be really tough on Iran never getting a nuclear weapon, on what happens to the enriched uranium. I mean, those are some of the key parts that Iran hawks here in Washington are so upset that it just sort of looks like they're loose threads that are not yet figured out. And then, of course, that $300 million restitution fund effectively, as well as the unfreezing of sanctioned Iranian money. I mean, all of that is why conservatives are so mad.
And it's so interesting because J.D. Vance, he said over the weekend, we're talking about ending Iran's nuclear program, and yet Iran denied that that was really a substantive part of these conversations. They said it mostly has focused on the Strait of Hormuz and Lebanon. But the text of that memorandum of understanding says they're talking about down-blending uranium. They're not talking about the transfer that President Trump said that he wanted. He wanted to see this material leave Iran and come to the United States. it's totally unclear that is something that they're open to. And frankly, President Trump made so many promises that he has not lived up to. He said that Iran would never have a civilian nuclear program. That is very much still on the table. A U.S. official told us they're not bothered at all about that program. But this is the very reason why President Trump started this war. He was so skeptical. There was so much skepticism about what they were doing with this material that's right now still underground. And yet we could be in a situation where it's still there.
When you look at the way the president is talking on social media this weekend, saying, I will happily rebomb them, he was much more colorful than that.
Yeah.
And then you've got these diplomatic talks happening still. It does lead to the question of, does he want to let diplomacy take its course?
I'm not surprised by these comments because he's done it throughout these talks. He's frankly always used the threat of force, of military action. And yet at one point he was talking about it as so overwhelming to the point where the U.S. would have all of this leverage, and yet clearly what we've seen is a compromise. Iran is getting so many things that they asked for, whether it's potentially unfreezing of assets, potentially in the millions, if not billions of dollars. That reconstruction fund that you're talking about, Vance says it'll be supplied by Gulf allies. It's just so far from what President Trump promised. The fact that missiles aren't included, that is why conservatives are upset, because they set out these such lofty goals and they've moved very far from them. I mean, this is still the outline that they're saying that they're working off of.
Yeah, and at the same time, if they end up coming down on the side of the White House where this deal is right now, it requires them to do a complete 180 on basically 10 years of Iran talking points that cut against basically the contours of this deal right now. Yeah. MS Now White House reporter Kayla Gardner, thank you. We are going to be reading your latest reporting on MS Now. It's all there.